Okay, so welcome everyone to this, our last CARE Forum of 2022. Thanks for being here. I know this is a very busy time of the year for many of us, so it's nice to see that people are still willing to turn out for a good discussion of care ethics. I'm Dan Inkster from the University of Houston. I'm the director of the Elizabeth Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership, which sponsors these events. I'm going to host today's event, but I also want to acknowledge the other members of the CARE Forum Advisory Board, Joan Tronto, Asha Bandari, and Lena Murillo. As you saw in some of our earlier sessions this semester, we're trying to rotate through who hosts these events. Although this is our last CARE Forum of 2022, it's not the last CARE Forum of the academic year. We're going to be starting up again on January 27th when Justin Clardy will be delivering his paper, Black Polyamory and Civic Tenderness. We then have several other presentations scheduled for the spring, so I'll be sending out an email about that probably in early January, but be looking for that. Our presenter today, I'm happy to say, is Talia Schaffer, Professor of English at Queens College, CUNY, and the Graduate Center, CUNY. Today, she'll be talking about her most recent book, Communities of Care, The Social Ethics of Victorian Fiction. Her previous book, Romance's Rival, Familiar Marriage in Victorian Fiction, won the North American Victorian Studies Association Best Book Prize for 2016 and was chosen as one of Choice's outstanding academic books. She's the author and editor of several other books and has published widely on Victorian familial and marital norms, disability studies, non-canonical women writers, and other topics. Professor Schaffer will get us started today with a 20 to 25-minute presentation, however long, we talked about this before. Then we'll open the floor to discussion and questions. As we've done the last few sessions, let's use the raise hand function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen if you're not, or if you've forgotten like me. I was saying at the beginning, every time I don't use Zoom for a few weeks, I forget how to use it. But if you want to make a comment, go to the reactions. There's a little button, and then there's a raise hand button, and you'll be put in order, and we'll call on you for questions or comments. If that doesn't work, or you don't know how to do that, just kind of wave your hand or something, and we'll notice you and get you in. Thank you, Professor Schaffer, for joining us today. I really liked the parts of your book that I read. I have a number of questions for you. I think what you're doing here is really fascinating. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let me get out of the way and hand things over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks. I can only see a few people at a time because I've got the share screen up. But I wanted to thank Dan and the board members for inviting me to speak, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming out today. I know it is the end of the semester. It's a hard time to find time for a talk, so I really appreciate it. And I wanted to say a particular note of gratitude to those of you who are willing to explore how a different field uses care. So just to say, when I started writing this book, I was on fellowship that was embedded in a philosophy department, and the philosophers kept saying to me, why would you use literature? The issue of care is so acute in the real world, everything from medical care to disability dynamics to political and social fights. Why would you use care theory for, of all things, British novels written 2 centuries ago? And I was like, yeah, that's a fair question. I can understand why you would wonder that. But the question that the philosophers didn't tend to ask me was this one. What can historical and literary work contribute to ethics of care theory? And that's what I hope to demonstrate today. So here is my book, my recent book, Communities of Care, that Dan mentioned, which explores these issues and offers a slightly different version of care theory. It's one that I've adapted to speak to historical conditions and enunciate principles that readers can use for literary critical analysis. Wayne Booth says that the unique value of fiction is its relatively cost-free offer of trial runs. So if you have like 100 books that show 100 different versions of care, no human beings were harmed in the making of those communities of care. You can kind of see how it plays out in lots of different ways. And Bridget Lowe has pointed out that my field, Victorian fiction, is the medium par excellence for an exposition of a sympathetic politics of care. So my aim in writing this book was to look at these hundreds, if not thousands, of imaginative immersions to enrich and expand our sense of how care works, because the novels play out different versions and they create complex representations and assessments of the forms of social relations under care. So this is an image I'm going to be coming back to, but I thought you might want something nice to look at as I talk about this. Here's one way Victorian fiction can reveal something different. So when we're thinking about care from a contemporary Western perspective, we are predisposed to focus either on the mass scale, hospitals, institutions, or the individual scale, an aide, a family member. But that is not the assumption in Victorian fiction. In the novels of this period, we see spontaneously generated collective groups of anything from 3 to 18 people. So when we move to the Victorian novel, we are being invited to look at care on a communal scale, which is not a formation we would necessarily gravitate to in contemporary care ethics. And the fictions work through the conditions and variations on that scale. So I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you're interested, but for instance, in The Wings of the Dove, Henry James explores what it's like to have a care community whose members cannot communicate. They are debarred from speaking to each other. Charlotte Bronte in Villette looks at what it's like to be giving care when you do not allow yourself to feel caring feelings about the people you're taking care of. And George Eliot, on the other hand, in Daniel Deronda, talks about what happens if you just feel a kind of promiscuous sympathy for everybody and everything, if you feel too much caring and you are inhibited from actually giving care. So I also want to point out that I think studying any culture that's not our only contemporary American or European context can really helpfully expand the purview of care ethics. So the Victorian era happens to be the one I know well, and for reasons I'm going to explain today, it has a lot of advantages for looking at care, but any other contemporary non-Western perspective is obviously also equally useful alternative. And so I try to see my work as analogous to the recent work on care ethics that centers Buddhist or Indian or African or indigenous theories. But if we go to the Victorians, we're being asked to displace ourselves in time, space, and culture. So it's sort of triply displaced. I wanted to start with some of the definitions from my book. This is how I define care: meeting another's need. And I want to just quickly explain the terms I've used. First, you may notice that this subject has no sentence, because in my view, anyone or anything can meet another's need. You can get care from a mountain, from the moon, from a stuffed animal, from an antique plate. They can all meet your need. As for the term meet, you don't have to solve the whole problem. You do have to meet the person's immediate need. So in other words, care names an ongoing relationship to changing needs rather than a fantasy of definitive cure. And that's partly because of the difficulty of sussing out need. Now, many of us teach, many of us are parents. We know that the people we're caring for may not be fully aware of their own needs. So in my case, teaching English, students often obsess about things like, does this paragraph flow? And the real problem is they don't have an underlying argument, right? If you have a kid, or if you've taken care of kids, your kid may be having a temper tantrum because they can't get a lollipop. The real issue is the kid is exhausted. So as a caregiver, you need to intuit the underlying need. But that's really hard because you don't want to deny the cared for's reality. You don't want to project your own preferences. And unless it actually literally is a child, you don't want to be in a maternal or paternal role telling them, I know what you really need. So it's supremely difficult, takes a lot of guesswork, a lot of trial and error, and a lot especially of checking in with the cared for. And it's equally difficult from the cared for's point of view. It's really hard to be honest about your real needs because often you don't know them yourself. And we've all had the experience of being super annoyed at some really minor trigger without being aware of what's really going on. Or our needs might be things we're embarrassed to admit. So communication all the time. By the way, the word need, I tried to make this a value neutral term because it's not limited to medical needs or pedagogical needs or parental or, child rearing needs. Anybody can have a need, even for good things. Somebody might win an award, but have imposter syndrome and need to be reassured. In a care relation too, you might satisfy somebody else's need only to have your own needs spring up and have the other person need to reassure you. So one example of these shifting needs might be something like the question and answer at the end of a talk like this one. The roles of carer and cared for slip around. So a questioner might need the speaker's help to understand the argument, but the speaker might also need the feedback. to understand if their argument is working. So again, communicating constantly. The other word I just want to explain briefly is the word another. In my theory, care is other-directed, oriented towards the other in the ethical tradition of Levinas and Buber. So I argue that if you want to do self-care, the best way to do that is to imagine an externalized version of yourself, to basically treat yourself for the moment as if you were the other. I can talk more about all this later if you want. Okay, here are some stock pictures of care communities. I wanted to look at what happens when you go to the community scale. So you'll remember I said care communities are maybe 3 to 18 people. They all converge for mutual help. And we all have these care communities today: sports teams, religious organizations, families of choice, clubs, co-workers, schoolmates, seminars, social networks. Some affinity or interest groups, like maybe film clubs or book clubs, and if you look at the bottom picture of all those people, that's like from a film club, they come together in friendly but distant combinations because they want to focus jointly on something beyond the group. And you can often tell because their body language is oriented outward. You can see how they're all sitting in a line. But sometimes people who come for that reason begin to turn towards each other, focusing on each other's need. And that's the other picture on the bottom. There's people sitting in a line, but they're turning into each other. And that's when it might become a care community. And it's interesting to me that if you read work on restorative justice or educational talking circles, the number one thing they do is arrange the seats in a circle. And so the picture of the seminar, you can see that, or the picture of the dinner. Once everybody is reoriented towards each other, the impetus is to focus on each other. And that produces some of the effects of a care community already. Okay, so those were stock pictures. I'm going to show some pictures you guys will recognize. So I think one reason we love ensemble casts in sitcoms is that they model care community relations. So I really think if I were a scholar of media, I would totally be looking at sitcoms for my case studies. Alas, I'm not, but maybe somebody here is. I also want to stress that many people have much deeper experiences of care communities, not as mere entertainment, but as a requirement for survival. So in the African-American experience, the practice of communally raising children is called other mothering, and it originated when enslaved mothers needed others to watch their children. It continued in the industrial economy to help parents working in factories. And as Annie Lowry points out on this slide, Black mutual aid groups are as old as the country itself. And I would add, have helped build the country itself, right? That childcare enabled the work that built this country. Another prominent instantiation of modern care communities is among LGBTQ people who often form families of choice, elective cousins, aunts, parents, siblings, formed by affiliation rather than biology. Those ties are based on commitments rather than tradition, lineage, or blood. And I just want to show you a slide of some recent books that take up this contemporary, more political work on care communities. And I can show this at the end if you want to get the names. Many of you, I'm sure, already know these books, but these are some really exciting ideas about how community can work politically to sustain people, care communities. Leah Lakshmi Peepson and Samara Sinha talks about care webs among disabled people, for instance. So again, I can bring this up later if you want it. But we're back to the Victorians here. And I just want to show you again, this is a small community, people caring for this woman. So in the 19th century, Victorian subjects at every class level took care of each other at home. They often did so quite badly, but that's not the point. The point is that they understood care relations not as something outsourced to hired experts, but rather as the ongoing experience of mutual accommodation with intimates. And you'll see a little tension in the image I put up here. The two people nursing the woman in the bed are clearly intimates, but there is a servant behind a door, a paid carer. So I want to keep in mind that the paid people are there, but they are distanced. This person is behind a door in different lighting, visually differentiated from the rest of the care group. Florence Nightingale remarked in 1860, every woman, or at least almost every woman in England, has at one time or another of her life charge of the personal health of somebody, whether child or invalid. In other words, every woman is a nurse. And Miriam Balin noted that the Victorian sick room could feel like a haven of comfort, order, and natural affection. because patients could create small select societies around their bedsides. And I want to show you a really good example of that. This is W.P. Fritz, the invalid. This is the picture I said I would come back to. And I want to just point out all the ways in which comfort is being produced in this image. So you have the sufferer who is sitting in the chair. There's a lot of attention being paid to forms of sensory comfort. So there's a bird here for music. There's roses or flowers there for scent. There's a platter of fruit for taste. This is a visitor. You can tell it's a visitor because underneath the table, you can see her feathered hat, and here you can see her umbrella. And she's come to read what looks like the Bible. So she's getting, giving the good word to the sufferer. This woman hanging over the sufferer may be the mother, and this may be, they look like they're maybe agricultural laborers, and outside the group, maybe another agricultural laborer. The woman reading the Bible, maybe from a higher class. And then there's this sort of skulking guy in black on the side. Is this a brother? Is this a lover? We don't know. But this is a social center here. So this is an example of what Balin is talking about. Ill health gave Victorians the chance to rest in a restorative care community and gave them the social support that made daily life easier. And daily life in the 19th century was often really brutalizing at every class level for different reasons. So care might involve tender touch, appreciation, communication, forms of alleviation that lay quite outside of medical attention. You will notice that there is no medicine in this image. So 19th century fiction frequently depicted these kinds of small select societies. You can think of any Dickens novel. This one happens to come from Dombey and Son, and if you know the novel, I've listed all the characters' names on the side. This care community is actually larger. There are 3 members who are not depicted in this particular illustration, one of whom is a dog, which I really love. But Dickens's care communities consist of teenage apprentices, homeless street urchins, orphan girls, elderly neighbors, local shopkeepers, cozy landladies, retired military men. They come together to help someone in need. They form a care community. And these care communities appear in fiction throughout the 19th century. In Dombey and Son, the person being helped is Florence Dombey, who is the woman in the black dress in the front. But I'm going to give you a few examples of how this works throughout the 19th century. And I'm going to start with Persuasion, which was written in 1816 to 1817. In Persuasion, caregiving creates social groups. As when Anne's sister Mary doesn't feel well, that's the first quote, and she calls on Anne to visit. This has the effect of moving Anne to a new place where she can form new social relationships. In fact, the need for care provides a perfect excuse for moving around and meeting other people. A traumatic disabling incident can do the same work as when Louisa falls. And if you don't know the novel, don't worry about it, but just, you can trust what I'm saying. There's illness and then there's disabling falls. And the image at the top right is from one of a Persuasion film. Louisa falls off the steps and smashes her head, and a care community develops around her that I just find really fascinating because it doesn't just include her family. It also includes their love interests, their neighbors, and a whole bunch of random people. Friends of friends, people that Louisa's never even met before. She does this at a place where she's on vacation. She doesn't live. And there's an ex-nurse, and there's a workman who just happens to be walking by and is needed to help carry her. So there are working people who help with the physical labor. So this kind of care community is governed by tacit rules. First of all, its members care for each other, not just for their joint patient. So one example I put on this PowerPoint is how they care for each other around Louisa. They're not all just focused in on Louisa, they're focusing on each other. The Musgrove family and the Harville family basically trade childcare and nursing care and food care. They're almost competing to see who's going to give the most care to each other. But what's interesting about this is they don't know each other. They're total strangers. So this care doesn't come out of pre-existing affection. Indeed, as Mary points out in this third quote, love can come from nursing, not the other way around. They've all learned to love Louisa by taking care of her. I also want to point out that this is a voluntary fluid group. The members move in and out of this circle. And if you know Persuasion, you might remember that there's a debate about who's going to stay and nurse Louisa, and they have to kind of figure this out and negotiate about it. Towards the end of Persuasion, Anne reunites with an old friend, Mrs. Smith, who suffers from a chronic disabling illness. I think it's identified as rheumatic fever. And Mrs. Smith explains to Anne that what helps her through her days is socializing, gossiping, and doing small handicrafts. She gets somewhat better at the end of the novel, mainly because she gets access to, better conditions, better food, and so forth, more interests. And nobody ever thinks of calling a doctor for Mrs. Smith. Cure is really not on the horizon. It's, again, about pleasant social relations. Things start to change a generation later. By mid-century, the kind of care groups that Anne Elliot participated in were no longer the default. They couldn't be taken for granted. There were now alternatives. So here is A Christmas Carol, which I thought most people would know about. It's published in 1843. And the way I read A Christmas Carol is that Scrooge refuses to join a care community and has to be re-educated. Instead, he prefers to rely on emerging public institutions, the prisons and the workhouses, the poor law, is in the top quote. He's outsourcing the work of care to the modern liberal state. And this story has to retrain Scrooge. As you see in the second quote, the ghost is like, no, this is your business. It's everybody's business. Conducted by the ghosts through a nightmarish lifespan in which he is left alone, from an isolated boyhood at school to a miserable deathbed without any mourners, Scrooge finally accepts the value of a community of care. One key point occurs when he revisits through the ghost's medium. He goes back, like in his mind, to revisit Fezziwig, his first employer, and that's the image at the top right. Fezziwig treats everybody equally and greets everybody the same way, as you see in the third quote. And that is a lesson for Scrooge. When Scrooge awakens, he eagerly helps to create two care communities. One involves his nephew's family, and the other involves the Cratchit family. And as a result of these care communities, Tiny Tim did not die, as the last quote tells you. Scrooge's personalized care, becoming a second father, that's a quote, to Tiny Tim keeps him alive. But as with Mrs. Smith, nobody thinks of calling in a doctor. It's about affection, attention, and affection, attention, and better daily conditions. It's not about a cure, but about ameliorating sufferers' daily existence. So disability studies scholarship, as some of you in the audience know, talks about the medical model. And this is Luke Filda's The Doctor, a painting from 1891 that in the medical profession was held up as an example of the devoted doctor, but I see it as a kind of nightmare scenario. The child is dying on these two, or is very sick on these two chairs. And behind the chairs, I don't know if you can see, the mother has her head down like this, and the father is standing there, but they are not allowed to touch the child. They are fenced off by the chairs. The light falls on the doctor, who is also not touching the child, who's just staring at the child. And this cup contains some medicine. This is the doctor's world. And the child is being examined, diagnosed, and a cure is being tried here. But there is no affection happening here. There's none of the traditional kind of care I'm talking about. So this is the medical model, the expectation that people will get a diagnosis, then a surgical or pharmaceutical intervention, followed by a cure, and that the idea that disability is a regrettable occasional flaw that professionals need to fix. This is not the model that you find in British fiction until after the 1850s. And it's one reason why Victorian fiction is so good for looking for care, because they don't have this in mind really until mid-century. And even then it's slow and partial and controversial, as we saw in A Christmas Carol. And in fact, around mid-century, even though this model is beginning to get in place, people very much distrust it. And they distrust it in Jane Eyre, published in 1847, just a few years after A Christmas Carol. It also works to compare the new world of paid professional care against the older practice of amateur home caregiving. And in Jane Eyre, every paid caregiver is hasty and neglectful. There's a hired apothecary, a doctor, nurse, and caretaker, and they all do a terrible job. You may remember Grace Poole, who gets drunk and, doesn't take care of Bertha Mason. So the only good care comes from personal amateur caregiving, like when Jane is collapsing from starvation and exposure, and her long-lost cousins take her in and shelter her and feed her and clean her clothes. And those relations of loving care with her cousins enable Jane to become what Rochester needs, what she describes as your neighbor, your nurse, your housekeeper. I'm not going to read all these quotes, but the reason I have them here is that Jane achieves a perfect care relation in her relationship with Rochester. Caring and caregiving are perfectly intertwined here. They're each feeding on the other, with the activity of helping somebody building more affection, which in turn makes it even more pleasant to help each other. And needless to say, this is a total fantasy. There's a reason this is a fiction. And Eva Feder-Kate has called care a costly morality. And we all know that it is extremely difficult to be a caregiver and also very hard to accept care from others. Bronte knew this herself. She had to nurse 3 terminally ill siblings who all died within 8 months. She had an elderly father, aunt, and a servant who all had serious health issues. So she's spinning out a fantasy and not a transcription of her own life. And I'm not going to talk about this here, but if you want to ask me about Charlotte Young's The Heir of Redcliffe, this is another book that I talk about in my book. And it's fascinating because it shows how care communities can go wrong. There's a disabled young man in The Heir of Redcliffe who basically becomes a tyrant, and everybody is catering to his needs at all times, and other people in the family are neglected. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay. So anyway, if I've been talking about Scrooge and Jane Eyre and, Austin, and you've been like, oh yeah, I remember, oh, I love those characters, you might think about those feelings as feelings of care themselves. A care community can exist in the mind, and maybe it always does. So today in the digital era, sociologists are beginning to think about virtual communities in which the participants need not share geographic space. Communal loyalties live in imagination, memory, and emotion. They don't require physical proximity. And I think our affinity for imaginary figures, for characters, is very similar to the way we feel about other people online very often. In other words, modern network communities depend upon and reinforce the mental skills required to imagine a community of the mind. And I love this Ray Paul quote. It's the title of his article, Are All Communities Communities in the Mind? And I think maybe they are. Okay, so having said that, here's some basic things about care that I've learned from studying these fictional examples. And you'll have noticed I hope you'll have noticed that they're coming up in the case studies already. I've tried to present these case studies in a way to highlight some of these issues. So viable care relations, and particularly in a care community, require participants to respect each other equally, to communicate with each other about their needs, and to be fluidly, flexibly willing to respond to changing circumstances. Part of that fluidity is what I'm calling here voluntary affiliation. People have to want to be there, and they also should have the right to leave a bad situation. If they aren't allowed to leave, they get resentful, and that messes up the dynamic in the care community. And I don't know, I'm not going to go all the way back, but you might remember that in the picture from Dombey and Son, there's one kid looking in from the skylight. His name is Rob the Grinder. He doesn't want to be there. He's spying on them and reporting to their enemy. He's going to mess everything up. So you have to be allowed to leave. Okay. These narratives the narratives I've been talking about today reveal that caregiving is an action, while caring is a feeling, and they are not the same thing. So if we think about our ordinary lives and our care in ordinary life, often we've all given care because we felt caring towards the recipients, but we have also all given care because we were paid to do it, or there was simply nobody else around who could do it. So in the book, I argue that acts and feelings run on different tracks. They can intertwine and produce each other, but they can also remain separate. Jane and Rochester achieve a perfect blend of feeling and action. But Cratchit and Scrooge give each other absolutely minimal care through most of that novella, and they only get to any feelings at the end. Sometimes the feeling comes first. Parental love can motivate someone to change a diaper, but sometimes the action performatively generates the feeling. If you change enough diapers, you might come to care about the person you're helping. And in the book, I talk a lot about care being performative, that doing the action produces the feeling. And if you remember back to that first image with the servant, I'm particularly interested in my book about the role of servants or paid caregivers who have to repeat a caregiving action often enough. And does that produce a feeling? What does that do in terms of reading those characters? How do we suss out their feelings if the feelings have to be enacted? I use Arlie Russell Hochschild's idea of emotional labor. If you have to enact a feeling as part of your job, how do we know the authenticity of that feeling? So anyway, while care actions and caring feelings are intimately intertwined and often do produce each other, they aren't the same things, and we can't always predict how they're going to relate or whether they will even coexist at all. It's also really important to remember that good care is fluid. Nell Noddings insists that, quote, parties are not stuck in their positions as carers or cared for, as, unquote, and that's exacerbated when you have a care community with multiple people. In a good care dynamic, the roles of carer and cared for can constantly switch, but many care dynamics were not good in the 19th century, in real life or in fiction, and many are not good now. So service workers often get structurally consigned to the exhausting role of carer. Disabled people often get consigned to the disempowering role of cared for. Getting stuck in a role on either end of that spectrum can damage your selfhood. So, as I was saying, the way earlier in the talk, the way to switch up roles and accommodate this fluid membership is through communication. And of course, communication can be nonverbal. It often is, you know, with infants or with pets. We often are engaged in care relationships that are nonverbal. The carer tries to ascertain whether a certain action will work. The cared for acknowledges it. And when the care has been extended and acknowledged, someone else's needs spring up to be in turn queried, met, and acknowledged. One thing that is absolutely necessary for a care community to work is egalitarian status. Members all have to be treated the same way. So I mentioned earlier that a question and answer period in a talk is a good example of a care relationship. Imagine how a Q&A would deteriorate if the moderator favors one or two people and ignores everyone else. You get resentment, which ruins the care community. But you might also think of a classroom, which I'm sure you all know is a paradigmatic care space. All students have to be treated with egalitarian respect. You cannot have favoritism or targeting. Even though the students may be unequal in their actual access to cultural or economic capital, in their status, in their ages, in every other way. So in other words, a care community doesn't magically erase the hierarchies of race, class, and gender, but it does provide a space in which we all tacitly agree to ignore them. And recognizing this can help us consciously promote such spaces, and by practicing such egalitarian respect on a smaller scale, perhaps we can learn to work up to the bigger. So let me end today by returning to the question with which I began. What can literary criticism contribute to ethics of care? As someone working in both fields, I would like to imagine the two fields in a kind of care relation of their own, mutually communicating, mutually respectful, egalitarian, meeting each other's needs. Ethics of care gives literary critics a valuable, adaptable, feminist, and disability-centered mode of thought that enables us to analyze the social phenomena we find in historical texts. Meanwhile, literary criticism can enable care ethicists to attend to representations of care from different cultures, where the scale and the functionality and the prerequisites for care work can help us figure out our own care behaviors, and where our predisposition to communities of the mind may make us identify intimately with characters' experiences of care, or as case studies. In that respect, literary criticism can speak to our own ongoing needs as people who are writing our own stories. How do we understand our own narratives, our lives and social relations? And how can we intervene to adjust them in the classroom, in the family, in the neighborhood, online, and in the nation? My hope is that stepping outside ourselves to study these representations can help us articulate, instill, practice, and internalize the skills that we see depicted there. For if Victorian fiction was long ago and far away, their hard-won knowledge from a care-centric culture is not alien to us at all, or at least it shouldn't be. Egalitarian respect, communication, fluidity, and voluntarism mattered then, and they matter now. They remain vitally necessary for a functional social world and for democracy today. Thank you. I'm just going to put up that slide again in case people wanted to write down the titles. I'll leave it up for a minute and then I'll stop sharing.
Well, thank you. That was great. That was a great talk. As I expected, you raised a lot of really interesting ideas. So we will open the floor now to questions, comments, discussion. Again, if you use the raise hand function, that's probably the easiest way to do it. That's at the bottom of your screen under the reactions. Let's see, when you click on the reactions, oh, there it is. It should say raise hand. And we'll just work through then. So go ahead, Eva.
Eva, you're still muted.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I have a number of questions. One, I'm not sure if you're using care communities as always being good, because you talk about poor care communities. So I'm wondering how you're using the term, whether when you say to create a care community, you're talking about always talking about one that is desirable and works properly. And this feeds into the question about egalitarianism. Of course, many of the pictures you showed us were pictures where there were both people of equal status, but also servants. And servants often figure in images of care, discussions of care, in all novels, whether they're Victorian or contemporary. So I'm wondering about the question of egalitarianism. And the third thing, I just wonder if you've ever thought about, or maybe you do talk about it in your book, the novel Germinal by Zola. That was one of the most instructive books to me in terms of care, in terms of shattering a lot of the images, normal images one thinks of as care, because the scenes of care that are most pronounced, most profound there, are of the coal miners when they're returning from their effort to talk to the coal mine owners to get better wages and better circumstances for their work. And they're so beaten up, they're so badly treated, and they're coming home and they're all sort of falling apart. They're all taking care of one another. And it's a care community of equals and a care community of men. There are no women in this care community. So it's a very interesting picture of a care community that is not that isn't guided by the normal gender norms that we have. And there's another part of that novel which is really awful, which is the picture of a very disabled daughter. You know the novel, so you know what I'm talking about. The very disabled daughter, who one of the coal miners actually winds, the father of a coal miner, an old coal miner, winds up killing because he couldn't stand the fact that, and it was a very strange scene. I don't remember it completely. And when I read it, I wasn't as aware of things as I am now. But and that's a real anti-care, anti-disability in the midst of this other kind of real caring for one another. So I'm sorry to take up so much time.
No, those were three really great questions. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go reread. I have not read Germinal since I think I was in college, so I got to go reread it right after this. No, it sounds like a really useful way to think about care. I mean, because I work on the British side, I wasn't thinking about French novels particularly, so maybe I should, look into that. In terms of your other two questions, are care communities always good? No, sometimes they're terrible. Like, why should amateur people be the people responsible for taking care of their family members? In the 19th century, they had no medical training. They weren't necessarily predisposed to do this well. They didn't necessarily know what they were doing. Pre-existing familial dynamics could get in the way. Often it's a terrible way to give care. So in my book, I try to make it as absolutely clear as I possibly can that there are a lot of advantages to moving to more professional medical work. And the medical model is arguably not one of those advantages, but yeah, I mean, Bronte had an awful time taking care of her family. It was traumatizing for her. So what I try to talk about is when a care community works perfectly, it's a glorious thing. It's a wonderful thing. We've all had experiences of these sort of friendship groups or, small groups that sustain us, and people are very grateful for them, but it's really, really hard to get there, and a lot can go wrong. And the thing that actually interests me predominantly in 19th century fiction is that something always is going wrong. And each of these novels is kind of a case study. What happens if you make one thing go wrong or another thing go wrong? Very infrequently does everything go right. And the third thing you asked was about egalitarianism and the servants. So actually that image from Dombey and Son that I showed is interesting in that respect. There's another woman in there, not Florence Dombey in the foreground, but behind her there was a woman named Susan Nipper, who was Florence's servant. And the care community also expands. And there's a guy named Mr. Toots who enters it, who is a friend of Florence's brother. And Mr. Toots is like basically a millionaire. He's going to be really, really wealthy. And he ends up marrying Susan Nipper. So in the real world, this wealthy guy who's been educated in a private school should not be marrying an out-of-work servant. That would be a class fall. Within the care community, everybody thinks Susan Nipper is the one who's condescending. She is so much smarter, has got so much more going for her. She is so much better, like, at making her way in the world, that it's kind of like, why did she take pity on Mr. Toots and marry him? So within the care community, those things get suspended. And as somebody who teaches at CUNY, I often see that happening in my own classroom, where I'm just reacting to students as students. And then afterwards, I'm like, okay, this one is working as a night janitor in a hospital. This one is working like as a waitress. Those things are not part of my experience. So the care community creates these little spaces. And I think what's interesting, and like that image that I showed you, R.H. Giles, the servant behind the door or behind the wall, is that there's a sense of, if we can't admit the servant fully into this care community, we have to visually differentiate her, because we can't sustain hierarchy within a care community. Okay. So Dan, do you want me to call on people, or do you want to do it?
You can do it. That'd be great.
Okay. Libby.
Hi, Talia. It's so nice to see you here, and thank you for the great talk. I was really interested in your definition initially of care, and this phrase meeting needs really sort of, I find, moving and evocative. I'm interested in sort of the temporality of meeting needs and the way time is working in your conceptions of care and these sort of images of it that you've offered us today. I associate a kind of ongoingness with meeting needs, and I've also learned so much from Eva Katay's, notions of dependency work, and the sense that it entails sticking around at some level. But then I've been trying myself to think about care happening in a classroom, or maybe another space like some of those images you presented at the beginning, those photographs, that's a more temporary configuration. And I feel like your sense of care community kind of takes in both of those temporal forms, that it can be ongoing, or it could just be something that sort of happens kind of in a situational way. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more maybe about your sense of time and its role in sort of good care, or the way it structures good care or good care communities.
I love that question so much, because I talk a lot in the book about temporality. So that's like a perfect question to feed me. Yeah, so what I say in the book is that temporality in caregiving is skewed. So sometimes you're taking care of somebody, and the felt experience of time is like, no time has passed. This is an intense emergency. I'm jumping in. Something has to be done. You're not even thinking about time. You look up and, maybe it's like a different part of the day and you don't even realize it. And sometimes time goes unbelievably slowly. And like if you're teaching a class and the class is not working and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through 43 more minutes of this? So, temporality is not a linear, predictable thing within care. And in the book, I actually have a chapter about that. The chapter that I have on that Charlotte Young novel is about temporality being inverted in that novel, in which it's about ancestry and children, and it's all inverted. Like the descendants are the ones that the ancestors come from, and the child is the one who is sort of the succeeding to the ancestors. It's hard to describe without going too far into that novel. But basically, yeah, I think temporality is really different. And the other thing to remember is that because there wasn't really this ethos of cure, most disorders were understood to be somewhat chronic in the 19th century. So even if they weren't, the people involved wouldn't necessarily know why something had stopped hurting. They didn't have concepts like remission, they couldn't necessarily diagnose what was going on. The body was kind of a black box. You didn't know what was happening inside. So the expectation was that if somebody was uncomfortable, you didn't necessarily know why, and you didn't know how long it would go on for. And so everybody was kind of set up for chronic disability, which is interesting because today in the medical model, as you know, chronic suffering is the thing that has historically been, or chronic disability or illness is the thing that's historically been kind of excluded from our purview. But in the 19th century, everything is chronic unless you make a remarkable recovery. And, even if you make a recovery, you might have illness afterwards that we're beginning to grapple with long COVID now. But, Victorians, that was the norm. That was the way things worked for them. So their understanding of the temporality of care need was also different from ours because they didn't expect it to be over anytime soon.
That's fascinating. So that it feeds much better into a model that's not necessarily oriented towards cure as the kind of medical model would be. The chronicity is sort of built into it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, Dan.
Thank you. Oh, I think Virginia wants to ask a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Virginia, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A point that I have emphasized a lot in papers that I've written since the ethics of care is that care has to be understood as much from the point of view of the recipient as of the provider. And if you do that, then you can undermine a lot of the problems that care sometimes might be thought to have, or care ethics might be thought to have, in that it doesn't acknowledge sufficiently the way caregivers can be not doing it well and not respecting sufficiently the cared for person. It can get into the problems of maternalism and paternalism too easily. So it's sometimes thought that the ethics of care supports the kind of paternalistic, maternalistic way of doing things. But if you emphasize that the things we say have to be understood as much from the perspective of the recipient as of the provider, then you can correct all that. I wonder I wonder what you think of that point, and if there are good examples in Victorian novels of understanding care from the point of view of the recipient and seeing in that way how it can correct any tendencies of care ethics to be too much like maternalism.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. That's great. And absolutely, I totally agree. You have to understand it from the point of view of the recipient. So one thing that's interesting is that in a care community, the care is fluid. So everybody is sometimes a recipient. So, if we're talking like who is the recipient in an exchange like our Q&A, I don't know. I mean, I'm the recipient now because you're giving me something to think about. But if I'm answering you in a way that helps you with the work you're doing, then you're the recipient. So one of the ways my theory sort of speaks to that is by saying nobody is stuck in those roles, that everybody is sometimes a recipient and sometimes a caregiver. So I feel bad I keep going back to Charlotte Young, who nobody has read except me and my poor students, so I make read it all the time. But basically everybody in Charlotte Young novels is disabled and or queer. So it's just such a great case study for anything you might want to do. So the disabled teenager in the Eyre of Redcliffe is somebody whose point of view we take a lot. And there's a kind of, he just doesn't get along with his cousin. And at one point, this teenager needs to get up and down the stairs. His cousin basically picks him up like an inert object and carries him up the stairs without saying, is this okay for you? Like, do you mind if I pick you up? Treating him as if he's just a commodity. Charlie, the disabled teenager, is angry about this and wriggles away and tries to get out of the cousin's arms and nearly falls down the steps until somebody catches him. And so that incident is sort of productive of a lot of thinking about what makes good care. On the one hand, the cousin lifting and carrying him seems like good care, but it's not treating him like a human being, not, you know, not doing that work of communication that I said was so necessary. And it contributes to Charlie's, he's the one who I said was tyrannical, it contributes to his bad sense of self because he internalizes the sense that he's not a full human being who needs to be asked or whose emotions matter. And so his tyranny comes out of low self-esteem because he's being treated like this. So we do see episodes like this. And later on in the novel, Charlie, the tables are turned and Charlie is enabled to give care to this very same cousin who has now in turn become disabled because everybody in Charlotte Young is disabled. And he feels really great. He loves doing that. It like makes him so happy to be the caregiver. So even though he's not mobile, he is disabled, he can be the caregiver to a person who has a different configuration of disability. And the book that I put up during my talk, Leah Lakshmi Peeps in the Samarasina, talks about how in a care web of disabled people, you know, one person who is verbal can help, you know, if they all go to the store together and can push the person who is not mobile. So we see a thing like that. Everybody should give care to everybody else, basically. Everybody should feel what it's like to be a recipient and be aware of themselves as a recipient. Everybody is vulnerable, but also everybody should feel that they are able to give care because that fluidity makes for a kind of healthy psychological life. Okay, so we got Dan and then Julie and then Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. So I want you to help me better understand this idea of how anyone or anything, you know, how you include anyone or anything that can meet another's needs in your communities of care. And I really want to understand this idea, right? Because it's something that like makes sense to me, but when I try to, you know, figure it out, like thinking about, you know, in particular, our relationship to nature and extending care to the environment of that, you know, it's something that's kind of there, but I always funnel it through people or humans or at least sentient creatures. And so you're talking about something else here, right? So you have right on page 15, you say that the rest of this book will show that Victorian care communities are diverse, fluid groups. Jane Eyre's care community includes the moon and the tall grasses. Miss Flight's has birds and scraps of papers. So you know, in a community of care, right? I can understand dogs, and I can, you know, I can get birds in there. I can maybe, you know, start to see a little bit with the tall grasses, but it gets fuzzier. And then, you know, when we get to the moon and scraps of paper, I'm sort of like, yeah, I want them to be in there. You know, I want the moon to be in my care community, but I don't know how to explain that. So I would like you to help me. If you could explain that, that'd be great, because it's something I earnestly want to be able to do.
Everybody should let in the moon. Yes. So the scene in Jane Eyre, she's this is when she's sort of dying of starvation and exposure, and she looks up to the sky and she feels comfort from the moon, and she says something like, "My mother, take care of me," and she sleeps in the tall grasses. So at that moment, that was the scene I was invoking here. She's literally taking comfort. It's meeting her emotional needs, if not her need for food and shelter. But yeah, what you said is exactly what I talk about in the first chapter of the book, which is the most philosophical chapter, not the one you read, but the next one in the book. So I say, we need to, when that happens, it's not that when she says, you know, the moon, my mother, she's not actively like in relation with the moon, which is really far away and has no idea she exists and can't be in this kind of mutual communicative relationship that I say. She's projecting something of herself into that moon. And so it's exactly what you say, that we understand the environment as funneled through a sentient creature or through ourselves. And I use D.W. Winnicott for this, that to externalize the self into an object beyond yourself is part of a healthy upbringing. This is a good thing that we do. So I think when we take comfort from an object, a stuffed animal from our childhood, for instance, if you see that stuffed animal and you're like, oh, you know, I missed you. Like, you can't really be in a care relation with an inert thing if you're expecting it to be mutually communicative, fluid, etc. You are in communication with an image of yourself that is sort of trapped in that stuffed animal. and that you remember and that you are externalizing at that point. So that's one way I deal with that in the book. But the other way is to think about Indigenous philosophy, in which sort of we are always enmeshed in communication with everything, especially in the natural world, especially. And I just find that such an empowering and magnificent and amazing thing that I'm just beginning to learn about. But that idea that, you know, it's not like we are the only beings that, you know, stride autonomously over the surface of the earth and we have a right to extract things that have monetary value from the earth, but that we are constantly in relation with, you know, spiders, with bark of trees, with rocks, with rivers. So Max Liboiron, who wrote this book, Pollution is Colonialism, or maybe it's Colonialism is Pollution, but I'll put his name in the chat. He's, or they, I should say they, sorry, I think they use they. They are a fish scientist in Canada. And one of the things they talk about doing is when they eviscerate these fish, obviously dead fish, you know, for their experiments, for their lab work, they thank the fish and then they say a prayer over the fish innards, returning it to the water. And so that seems like a really good example of exercising care with a thing that we would not normally think of as an entity that could return care, the fish guts, you know, but if from an Indigenous perspective, like Liboiron's, that is the appropriate mode of interaction with the natural world. And I think it's something we can all maybe aspire to learn about. Okay, Julie.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's so nice to meet you here. First of all, I'm a first-year PhD student in CUNY English program, and I'm glad to hear the special qualities of care community and Victorian novel, especially compared to more like contemporary medical care. And that's very interesting. But my question actually goes back to 18th century. You know, there are also good and bad examples of care community in relation to sentimentality and also friendship and also women writers. If you think like there's Mary Wollstonecraft's novels, Mary Maria and Matilda, and also many, maybe we can also find some care communities and by reading 18th century letters of women writers. So I was thinking a lot about that while listening to your presentation. So what would be the main difference between Victorian and 18th century care community? I'm really curious about it. Thank you.
Oh, such a good question. And Julie is saying it's nice to see each other here because we're in the same department at the grad center. So it is nice to see you here. So I'm going to give one answer, but I'm also going to see if Chris wants to speak about that, since Chris is an 18th centuryist working on care. I think the biggest difference between 18th and 19th century is the rise of the medical model, the rise of medical professionalism, public institutions, which means that the caregiving or care communities has become endangered. It's become the locus of nostalgia in these 19th century novels, and therefore it acquires a special emotional kind of valence for these writers. Like you see it in A Christmas Carol. It's really, really important and meaningful that Scrooge should go back and pick this and choose to affiliate himself with this earlier model, that he should reject the emerging model of outsourcing care to professional institutions. So, you know, Leonard Davis said that the normate emerges in the 1840s. The idea of the normal emerges in the 1840s. And although Asaka Joshua has talked about it, has found some earlier examples of it, like 1820s and 30s, I think it seems right to me that it really kind of emerges into public thinking in the mid-19th century. So if you don't have a concept of the normal, you just have a really different landscape for judging people's bodies and suffering. And like if you read Austen, you know, there's a lot of people in Austen who are sick in ways that today we would tend to say they're not really sick. They're making it up. Mrs. Bennet's nerves in Pride and Prejudice. Austen never does that. There's no, Mrs. Bennet has nerves. And, you know, what does that mean? And maybe the nerves are real or not, but the point is she feels them and people have to cater to them. So Chris, do you want to add anything about, especially about Wollstonecraft?
Well, not so much about Wollstonecraft, but I would say that the 18th century is not terribly fertile territory to be looking at care communities because they are so much taken for granted. But what's nice about your study is that you're at that point where there's a change occurring. And so you have a measurement, a metric to judge by as the medical model becomes more instantiated, more a part of the society. And you do that wonderfully with Jane Austen, Sanditon, I think it is, the unfinished novel, where there's a beach resort, but it's also kind of a curative community, but that's an unfinished novel. You have, in the 18th century, Clarissa is the one that really comes to mind with the deathbed scene that goes on for, I think, 250 pages. I'm exaggerating, but it became a model for a lot of other novels of the period where afterward there was always the long death scene, but it's always attended by, family members who are doing the hospice care essentially. But there are very few doctors because the doctors was really not a respected profession. So you don't have the sense of professionalism or institutionalization taking place. So it's not really there. There's a mock death scene in Camilla by Frances Burney in the 1790s in which Sir Hugh is on his deathbed. It's an equally long scene, but then he gets better. And I think it's actually a joke that Burney is pulling on, have a little wry commentary on Clarissa that, he's dying, he's giving his pronouncements and he's giving his last words, and suddenly he's up and walking around, he's fine for the rest of the novel. So it's a fake death scene for humorous effect, I think. But the problem is in the 18th century, you don't have that same kind of wealth of opportunity to write about care communities. They're just so much part of the community itself that's almost, it's unremarkable.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's great. Okay, Jenny, and then Laura.
Thanks. So thank you so much for this great talk. In the book that I've just finished with Tom Mallison that's in production now, the main thing we call for is the creation of communities of care. And so I'm delighted that I'm behind on my copy edits, which means I'll have time to add your site, because I think a lot of people think of communities of care as a kind of utopian concept, even though, of course, some people know that, like you said, they've existed in poor communities for forever. But so I have a question on equality, but I wanted to first pick up the conversation about care for the earth, which was implicit in Dan's question. And when I first told my co-author that I was going to include this big section on care for the earth, he said, but that doesn't really fit our criteria, which is that it has to be care that builds a relationship. And I said, no, if you look at everything in Indigenous writing, it's about a relationship with the earth. And so part of what I spent time on in that section was, how do we learn to experience mutual care from the earth so that we can actually experience responsibility in return? And the answer was actually care action. That is, following examples from some Indigenous authors like Robin Wall Kimmerer, gardening. When you do the work, you come to experience this gift of return as a gift from the earth. You experience the care from the earth and are then able to actually feel a sense of mutuality. Because I think that's one of the themes that is similar in my book and yours, is the importance of mutuality. And so that it really is absolutely not about projection of self onto something else. It is about a mutual relationship, and that care turns out to be central to that. So that's a comment. But the equality thing that I thought was so interesting, because again, I talk about the importance of mutuality, but one of the particular twists I put on that is that care routinely actually involves inequalities, right? One person is in need of care, is vulnerable to the caregiver. That caregiver you're vulnerable to could be economically dependent on you, right? There are all these intersecting webs of inequality. And then the puzzle of how you sustain a genuine mutuality of respect and mutuality of concern for mutual care in the face of these inequalities is part of what I think is so important about care, is that people do learn how to do that, so that inequalities are not immutable and insurmountable. They are out there, right? Parent-child, that's just a human reality, but care can shift it. And so the specific question I had for you, but mostly I really just wanted to say thanks, but was whether you found images, stories that you thought captured a successfully mutual respect between the paid help, who, we see them off in the background there, and the unpaid caregivers and the recipients of care? Like, are there images of in a highly class-based society overcoming, in the context of care, this differential?
Oh, I'm so excited for your book, Jenny. Would you mind putting the title in the chat? Because I'm going to go look that up immediately.
So it'll actually be out in March, but I could send you things.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
and I will put it in.
I'm dying to read this. It sounds so exciting. And actually, the last thing you asked about paid help and unpaid help. So my next project I'm thinking is going to be about sort of paid care. So I can use that for the next project as well. So you said so many interesting things, and I do want to, about care for the earth. First of all, I do want to say the idea that we are projecting a self into an external object, that's Winnicott. So that comes out of psychology.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Right. So that's different from the indigenous answer, which is that the earth can speak back to us. And I like both of those answers. And in communities of care, I just kind of lay them both out. I'm like, these are two answers to that question of how do you give care to the inert or, the natural world, and kind of pick your own. Oh, wow. Thank you. I can't wait to read this book. So I'm getting more and more interested in the indigenous answer personally, and I love that idea of gardening. One of the things that I see, one way I see it also is in terms of architectural restoration, antiques, like the work that you do to preserve the past. So in the book I talk about, as literary scholars, we're trying to preserve an understanding of texts that are vanishing, sometimes physically vanishing, sometimes if they haven't been, digitized, the pages are crumbling away, or preserve a way of reading things using information that hardly anybody has anymore. And that to me also feels like a mutual thing that, Charlotte Young doesn't know that I'm trying to care for her, like she's dead, but in some way it feels mutual. It feels like the text is rewarding me for the care I'm putting into her. In terms of how do you sustain mutual respect, that's the fluidity, so I think the problem, you're absolutely right that care can create inequalities and care can shift inequalities, but the problem is getting stuck. That's the real problem, because both being a carer and being a cared for are both disempowering in different ways. If you're a cared for, you can't, you feel like you're dependent on somebody else to do basic things. But if you're a carer, you feel like your own needs are not being met. You're dedicated to somebody else. You have to be able to shift those back and forth. Otherwise, it's just super, bad for everybody. And in terms of the representations of mutual respect between paid and unpaid help, I think that image from Dombey and Son, where the servant is the integral member of the care community, might be one of them. Sorry,
I'm so sorry. I have to answer the door. I'm the only person in the home. I'll be right back.
Okay, bye. Yeah, so anyway, I think there are some cases in which the servant becomes the, internal to the care community. But one of the books that I work on is Charlotte Bronte's Villette, which is told by a caregiver. And in my book, I read it as the first representation of the point of view of a global migrant caregiver that I know of, the earliest one. And Jamaica Kincaid has a book called Lucy, which is sort of based on this. And so I think Jamaica Kincaid recognized this when many literary critics have failed to recognize this. But it's about how does it feel to be in the consciousness of a paid caregiver. And there are very few texts like that in the 19th century. The Brontes produced most of them because they had that experience. They worked as governesses. But I thought, for instance, I might do George Moore's Esther Waters, and literary scholars in the audience will know that that is a novel written from the point of view of a servant, and not just a governess, but like a maid of all work. I started reading it and I realized Moore is paying absolutely no attention to the labor that Esther Waters does at all. That's not part of his point of view. He's just depicting the servant as a person who has the same feelings as any kind of, middle class 19th century romantic protagonist. So there's not a meaningful attention to service in that book. So I'm still looking for it, but so far Dickens, who obviously worked for a living, and the Brontes were the best sources for that. Okay, there's a bunch of, yeah. Okay, Laura.
Thanks. This was so interesting. So I'm not far from you. I'm in New York. I'm at Fordham, and I'm a philosopher. And I'm going to try to not make this question too philosophical because I loved getting to learn about Victorian literature. But so my question is about how your defining needs. So when you defined it broadly. But one thing that struck me is that a lot of the examples you used seem to imply that needs are largely material, right? So like thinking about medical contexts and mutual aid groups. And part of why I'm asking this is that a benefit of material needs is that they're largely objective, right? If someone is ill, a lot of people can say, okay, that person needs medical help. And I'm wondering about other kinds of needs. So I'm thinking in particular about a lot of recent work on like echo chambers and these small kind of communities of people who end up reinforcing each other's knowledge. You can think about like conspiracy theories or even like a cult type situation where you have people who seem to be meeting each other's like needs for a certain type of knowledge, where that need might be subjectively defined, right? Like they feel like what they need is that information they're getting from other people in the group. But objectively, there might be questions about whether or not those epistemic needs are being met. And so, so maybe this is drawing you too far outside your project, but I wonder if needs are largely thought of in this Victorian context within care communities as material. And if not, is there room for affective and epistemic needs? And does that kind of complicate how we're thinking about care communities?
Oh, I love your question. That is so great. Yeah, absolutely. Needs can be emotional, intellectual. So, you know, the example I gave was somebody who wins a prize you would not think would have a need based on that, but who might say, oh, I don't deserve it, or, oh, I feel survivor's guilt, like all these other people didn't, or take like in the academic job market, you know, a student of mine who would get a job might feel that kind of survivor guilt about it. That's a real need, you know, that's an emotional need that has to be assuaged. I would like it if every student got a job and that was the worst of their problems, but you know, so yeah, I did. You're absolutely right. I did try to make needs as general as possible, but your example of an echo chamber or a cult is a really great example. I gave a talk about this before the pandemic in Illinois, and somebody said to me, what about somebody who has a substance abuse disorder, who says, what I really need is my drug, or what I really need is my drink, you know? So this is part of the difficulty of communication and the difficulty of maternalism or paternalism, is that if you are the caregiver, or if you appoint yourself as a caregiver, you might have to say like, that's not your real need. You don't need a drink. You don't need to tune into, you know, your right-wing bubble or your cult leader's perspective. And they'll say, yes, I do. So, you know, you're overruling them with your sense of their real needs. Your real need is to have a more varied news diet. And that's a really problematic thing to do to another human being. So that's why it's hard. I mean, care is really, really hard. We all know that. And so that's all I can say is, you know, continued communication, explaining why. They explain why they don't need it. They explain why they're perfectly happy in their cult. You respond. You allow them to be the caregiver sometime. Okay, so if you believe that this is true, you know, tell me why it's true, and like that they'll feel good. And you're like, okay, tell me more. And you can kind of maybe break it down that way. But it's all about discourse. It really has to be. But one of the things I say in the book is that care is a spectrum. So it's not just like you give care or you don't give care. So you're right that material needs often are self-evident. So when Jane Eyre collapses, it's clear that she needs food. She's dying of starvation. That's obvious. But what kind of food and how much food, you know, that has to be negotiated. And I use food as an example of that spectrum. So I say, you know, you can give somebody care by giving them, you know, generic food from a cafeteria that was sort of industrially produced and didn't have, and that's enough to sustain life. But it goes all the way up to like care made, you know, food made by a person who is beloved according to a beloved family recipe, served on, you know, heirloom plates, which is, it means that the care fires on multiple cylinders, aesthetic, emotional, affective, as you said, as well as sensory. So even within the material world, there are degrees of care that can be offered. Okay, Joan and then Jayon. Joan first, yeah.
I thank you so much for this wonderful talk, wonderful chapter. Can't wait to read the rest of the book. And at some point I have to get back to the Victorian novel. I want to ask a question that really builds in part on some of the other questions, including Laura's question just a minute ago about needs. I want to start by saying that your definition of care is very broad. I like broad definitions. In fact, most of the care in the world, I would say, happens outside of care communities, not in care communities. And so this raises the question about the relationship between care communities, the care that you get there, and care more broadly. And there are a couple of things I want to ask you about there. One, to what extent do care communities arise out of necessity? So it's a play on the word needs, but so poor people have care communities, and yes, they do. And they do in large part because they got nothing else, right? And so, especially in a society that's as materialistic and is oriented towards wealth as ours, to be poor is to be in the need of something else. And so care communities often arise out of necessity and therefore may be partly poor. But there's another way in which the poor get forced into, and I was interested to hear that your next project will be about workers, because Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's book has this wonderful title that captures this problem. She talks about people who are forced to care, right? And that's how she describes the global trade in labor, right? People who are actually forced to care. And so it raises this question again about the conditions under which care communities exist. You know, I'm a student of Sheldon Wolins, who speaks of democracy as a fugitive thing, and I'm wondering if care communities in a capitalist economy are a fugitive thing. That is, they can only occur in places that are rare and kind of specialized and outside of the normal ways in which we organize most of life, which is hierarchical and so on. So you see where this is leading me. It's leading me to the question about the politics, the big politics here. And that is the question you just said, in a way, communication is the solution to this problem of people who misunderstand their needs. It's all about communication. It's all about discourse. But of course, there's always the response. Republic line 10, suppose they won't listen, or suppose we won't listen, and so we're not going to learn anything, right? And there's a way in which that raises the question, how do you create the political conditions for care communities to emerge? And to me, that was the political question that came out of your presentation that I find really, really productive and really generative. I don't have an answer to that question. I think I have some pieces of an answer, but I just like to hear you respond to that. And thank you for this really generative, interesting, fascinating talk.
Thank you for all of those responses. And, you know, as the person who gave the definitive definition of care all those years ago, this is great to hear you interacting with the work that I'm doing on this. Yeah, there's a book called Global Woman that was edited by Barbara Ehrenreich and Arlie Russell Hochschild, and there's a lot of work it includes an article by Evelyn Nakano-Glenn and a lot of other thinkers on this topic, like being forced to care. It's sociological work about the point of view of the paid caregiver and global care chains. So you're asking basically, how do you make care communities arise today? Are they fugitive? What happens if people don't listen? How can we create a politics that enables them to emerge? So my answer might be slightly disappointing, but I would say I don't know if they should emerge. I mean, I feel like, so one of the books I read on care, I forget which one right now, started by saying people always think care, or it was a book I read on community, sorry, and it started by saying community is one of those words that always sounds good to people,
Yes,
but isn't always good. Like, so one of the things, like one of my pet peeves, one of my pet peeves is people who are like, oh, how do we make our classrooms into communities of care? It's like, we have to listen to our students. We have to empower our students. I'm like, first of all, I don't know if a community should be a community of care, if a classroom should be a community of care. Communities of care are really good for a number of quite limited things. They're really good for making their participants feel better. Is that what a classroom should be? Is that what a nation should be doing? I mean, maybe so in a nation, but maybe there are other things. And one of the things I say in the book is that there are a lot of other ways to organize social groups, and some of them are better for different reasons. If you're trying to teach people a vital skill, you don't want them all inquiring of each other. How are you feeling? And what can I do to make you feel better? You want to be like, here is how you operate the blowtorch. Everybody watch, So, you have bureaucracies, you have hierarchies, you have military organizations. Care communities are one form among others. They are good for some things, but they're not good for other things. I don't necessarily think they're always good for academia. And I think that we need to get away from the assumption that a care community is necessarily a place of loveliness. And actually, the Victorian novel is a really good way to do that, because you read enough of these things and you're like, I do not want to be friends with these people. These are awful people treating each other really, really badly. On the other hand, obviously, I wrote this book because I have an ethical commitment to some of the things that the care community can do. And that was how I ended the talk today, is thinking about the values of egalitarianism. I think it's wonderful. It's lovely to have a space within which hierarchies are suspended, within which everybody's needs can be heard and met. I mean, what a dream that is. How amazing is that? Can that be sort of blown up to the scale of a nation or a political organization is another question. So I have a chapter on Daniel Deronda, which is trying to imagine the foundation of a new nation as a care community. And in my view, Eliot completely fails. She can't imagine things like citizenship or taxation or voting because her mind is in the care community, and those things aren't part of a care community. So that would be my response. But Joan, if you figure out how to make the political conditions right for the instantiation of care communities, and then how to make care communities work well, like, I would love that. I would love you to write that and publish that, and that would make our lives better, I think. Okay, Jae-yoon, who is also from my department. Hi, Jae-yoon.
Hello, Talia. All right. So nice to see you here. And actually, my questions, I think, like all the questions that was raised were so great. It's kind of overlaps with Laura's and John's questions they brought up just now, and it's so great to listen to all your questions and answers. But well, I guess it'll be kind of from a different lens. So I hope it kind of helps articulate other aspects. Well, first of all, I want to ask, I think everyone's asking this question, and it's involved this question of scale. Well, and I thought your presentation was like ingenious because it gives us an alternative lens to think disability from a like very different like perspective, like because it's like radical in that it moves away from the traditional idea that disability is purely like regrettable, but it could be like generative, especially in terms of community building, and as Joan brought up in their question, I was wondering if this is possible because of that scale of a community that you say it's unit of communication and mutuality and egalitarianism. Joan said it was it like fugitive, like, you know, like a kind of a utopian or like political unit that enables us to, like, you know, imagine the otherwise that's different from like atomized individual or like very big like nation state scale, which you kind of started off saying that Victorian novels envision like imagine different scale of care communities, right? So I was started listening to your presentation thinking of that specific scale that is not super individual, like super domestic, but not too huge as to like nation state. And I was focused on that, but I think, and which kind of enables like a very like, I don't know, something enables us to imagine the alternative thoughts about care and disability and our body and affect. But I don't know, at some point you want to leap the unit of discussion to broader scale, I guess. It's always present in your discussion of care. So I was just curious how you think about like the relations between like these multiple scales, because I think what you suggest Victorian novels do like is special is that there is this specific scale that provides us like space of discussion specific to that history. And the other one was it's already kind of addressed by Laura, if I may, about your definition of needs. That it was very broad and very generic because it's broad. And you did admit that it's very slippery, like you don't know who needs what, like even the person themselves don't know what they need themselves. So it's like kind of suspended definition that might be more generative. It could be material, it could be effective. My question, simply put, is how is need different from desire? Because I think you're kind of moving more towards, you know, need can be a emotional thing. It calls for feelings and affects. And I was just kind of, you know, confused between need and desire. And I think Jane Eyre's case, where Jane and Rochester makes a very like harmonic care community. The care and desire, both care and desire is there. That's why they're so happy with this caring and desiring. So there's care and also erotic, like kind of working together. That's why it's like so fantastically kind of happy ending. Although that also is like scaled in a very like small community, right? So I was just that's I was curious because you also brought up Jane Eyre's case, which I think involves like this question of desire. Yeah, that'd be a third two question. And thank you for your amazing presentation as always.
Thank you so much. And thank you for, you know, summing up all the questions to date. This was like a very useful summary of the whole thing. Yeah, can we leap to a broader scale? I think that I would first want to know, why should we? Like, are care communities a good thing? I mean, if they all work perfectly, then yeah, I guess they're a good thing, but they don't all work perfectly. And I don't know if fluidity is possible once you get beyond like, 18 people, I said was probably the maximum. I don't know, maybe the care community on a broader scale ceases to be a care community. How many people can you add in? When I was looking for those stock photos, I was looking for a picture of like the people around the table, and it came up with an article from Bustle that said a maximum of 5 friends. 5 friends is all you can have. So people out there have been thinking about how many friends can you actually have. So I don't know if you can do it on a larger scale. Can you have, so one of the things I say about people trying to use care communities to think about teaching, if you have an intro to psychology course and there are 400 students, is there any way that can really be a care community with 400 people? I don't feel like it could be. And that's why, you usually have it broken up into smaller discussion groups, because only at a smaller scale, but maybe at 30 you could be, so maybe you can push it a little bit to 30. I don't think you can push it to 200 or something. And I would want to know why you would want to do that. I think it would compromise the fluidity and egalitarianism and inclusiveness of the care community if you push it too big. Your other question about needs versus desires, and it's a really good question. I think I would maybe say wishes rather than desires, because at least in our culture, desires has this erotic connotation. And so I wanted to I use needs instead because it's just a bigger word, and you can have an erotic need, but you can also just, have wishes or preferences or bad feelings or something like that. So need was just the biggest word I could find. As you said, it is really broad and slippery. Desire can be a need, but also maybe your real need is not to give into that desire. Jane has desire for Rochester, which her real need at a certain point of the novel is to reject that and run away from him. So I think needs is a better term than desire, just because it allows for more. It allows for people to have different affiliations and identifications. Whereas desire, again, like I feel like erotic desire, that's a very 20th century idea of love. It's not necessarily the feelings people have in the 19th century novel. So even for my case studies in the Victorian era, desires isn't going to work as well as needs. Jenny,
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Talia. That was fantastic. We've exceeded time, you know, because there's so much to talk about, but I really enjoyed that. Thank you all for coming. And, you know, that was a great discussion. You know, it's always wonderful. I learned so much from these things. So I hope we can all convene again on January 27th for Justin Clardy. And until then, I hope you all have happy holidays and a happy new year, and be safe and enjoy yourselves. And we'll see you in the new year.
Dan,
Oh,
can you put
good.
Talia's email? Is that all right, Talia?
I already put it in the chat. Contact me if you want to talk.
I didn't see. Okay.
Okay.
Got it. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you.
Such a fun conversation.
Thank you, Talia.
Thank you.